Hi everyone, hope everything's going okay. Welcome to Module 5 of the course. In Module 5 this week, we're going to be looking at Chapter 7, which is Measuring Domestic Output and National Income. The two required assignments that you have this week are Discussion Board number 3 and Quiz number 4. Make sure that you review the requirements on the discussion board. In the discussion board, I'm grading your 3 responses that you post. Your first post should be by Wednesday of each week by 11:59. You're going to you need 2 peer responses, and your peer responses can be to any of your peers or any of the questions that I post in the course, as that will be fine as well. With your initial post, make sure to focus on your content and how you're addressing the question, because that's very important to look at. With your initial post, you need to make sure you have an APA formatted in-text citation and reference as well, because that will help with your analysis in terms of what we're looking at. And that will help with your support as well. Now for this week with Chapter 7, we're going to be looking at measuring domestic output and national income. Now this is an interesting week because we're going to be looking at the role of GDP in our economy. And the role of GDP is very important because it really defines what we're producing in our economy. And GDP is a basic measurement of economic performance. It's the market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's border within a year. So that's the key thing you want to focus on, where it's being produced at, and the time frame involved. Now, when we look at the final goods and services, that's the key that we're looking at. Those are purchased by the end user, whereas intermediate goods are those produced by the resale or for further processing or manufacturing. Intermediate goods are things to make the final goods. So when we look at this role of GDP, we're trying to evaluate how we make basic decisions in our economy and how these decisions are made by how our economy is growing. And GDP is one way to evaluate how our economy is growing. A couple terms that you're going to find that are very helpful for this week. Let me see if I can log in here and give you some key tips. Some concepts that you're going to be very important. Final goods, intermediate goods, the difference between a durable good and a non-durable good, a service, GDP versus GNP, and also the difference between real and nominal GDP as well. So a durable good is a good that lasts over 6 months. A non-durable good is something that lasts less than 6 months, easily consumed. Nominal GDP is looking at price times quantity. So it's evaluating current output, current price level. Whereas real GDP is measuring a fixed or constant price. So those different GDP levels are very important to evaluate in our economy. So on the quiz, you're going to have 20 questions. And with these 20 questions, people could get different questions, but I want to focus on what are some types of questions that you could look at, okay? And I'm going to go through a list of them. Something you might see is an example of a final good or service, an example of an intermediate good, and an intermediate good, you'll notice, is something to make the final good, so that's important to note. Now, GDP and its estimation. Does it overestimate economic welfare or underestimate economic welfare? What is a transfer payment? A transfer payment is a payment from the government to individuals or businesses. You'll notice that a transfer payment is excluded from calculation of GDP. Another question you might see is what's a price index? How to calculate GDP, which is consumers, businesses, government, and international sector. Another question on final goods and services. Another question on how we calculate GDP, which is the CIG net exports. Another question on what GDP excludes for spending of consumers and businesses. What does it exclude? Buying stocks and bonds is not included in GDP. Another couple questions on what GDP excludes and what GDP is. Now, government purchases, that's another question you might see on the test. Government purchases, what does that include? Government consume is focused on consumption and capital goods. Calculation of GDP, that's another important one. How do we calculate GDP? And that's focused on the role of international sector. National income, what that measures. Net exports, what would that mean if it's negative? If we have a negative net exports or a positive net exports. And the last four questions will deal with nominal GDP and real GDP. When we look at real GDP, you're noticing it's only focused on the role of constant price and current output level. So it's only measuring what output changes there are. And make sure to note when you start the quiz, you have to end it at that point, as you only get one attempt and the clock is continually running. If you have any questions, let me know, but I look forward to your effort this week.